Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us on Crossroads Politics here on WTHR Streaming. I'm Dustin Grove.
And I'm Emily Longnecker. Two of Indiana's state Senate races are now heading for a recount.
And we're going to get to both of those, but the one getting national attention is where we start. It's one of those redistricting retribution races.
Incumbent Spencer Deary winning by just 2 votes over Trump-backed challenger Paula Copenhaver. On Tuesday, Copenhaver officially filed for a recount. Not only does she want every ballot recounted, but she is singling out 14 voters who she says voted illegally.
Not because they aren't allowed to vote in Indiana. She says they shouldn't have been able to vote in the Republican primary.
On Wednesday, I sat down with one of the voters who says he did nothing wrong.
Least you can do as an American citizen is vote.
That's a lesson Christopher Wood tried to impart to the high school students he taught decades ago.
And I said to them at the end of the class, there's only one thing that I want. Vote. If you learned anything, learn that it is your responsibility to vote.
Wood says he'd teach that same lesson today, even as the vote he just cast in this month's primary is being questioned.
I just don't understand it.
Wood voted for incumbent Republican State Senator Spencer Deary over Deary's challenger Paula Copenhaver, who's asking for a recount after losing by 2 votes. But in these court documents, Copenhaver doesn't just want a vote recount. Her team wants to question 14 voters, including Wood, under oath about their voting history and their choice to vote in the most recent Republican primary. Copenhaver's team claims some of these voters spoke to reporters or posted on social media that they had crossed over from their normal party affiliations to vote in the Republican primary, but planned to vote for a Democrat in November. Copenhaver's arguing those voters' ballots should be thrown out.
I have never heard before when someone has asked for a recount where then they are going after the actual voters.
Under Indiana law, a voter can be challenged at the polls when they ask for a particular party's ballot if a poll worker or even another voter believes that person normally doesn't vote for candidates in that particular party. If that happens, the person can still vote, but they have to sign an affidavit saying in the upcoming general election they'll vote mostly for candidates in the party whose ballot they chose in the primary. Wood says he voted in Republican primaries in Indiana before, and when he did this time, he says no one ever challenged him when he asked for a Republican ballot. Wood identifies as an independent and says he voted for Deary in part because he supported Deary's vote against redistricting, something he says he shared with a reporter.
Because he had the integrity not to be pressured into doing something that he morally thought was wrong.
But Wood says he's also voted for Democrats before, too.
I think you choose not the party, the person.
And for Wood, that means if a recount in the Senate District 23 race happens, and Spencer Deary isn't the Republican nominee come November, and Paula Copenhaver is,
Are you going to vote for her?
Absolutely not.
leaving Wood to vote for a Democrat when it comes to picking who he wants to represent him in the Indiana Senate.
I don't believe in not voting for someone.
He seemed pretty confident he did nothing wrong here. Was that your take?
Yeah, confident that he did nothing wrong. He says he identifies as an independent. He says he's lived all over the country and voted in primaries on both sides before. He looks at this broadly as voter intimidation. He says he's not intimidated, and if he gets called in, he'll go in and talk about what he did and why he did it.
And you spoke with a number of other voters who were mentioned in that, who were named in that report. What do they
Yeah,
have to
we
say?
actually went down the list and called and left messages and talked to 3 other people. One person called the claims baseless and said that they had voted in the last Republican primary. Another called the being named, in these court documents, petty. And another one said, I never vote a straight ticket. I vote in Republican primaries all of the time. So they did not understand how they were named in these court documents. Many of them didn't know it until we called and said, hey, you're on this list of 14 folks. So they were learning about it for the first time.
Okay. We'll continue to follow it, see where it goes.
Yep.
The Deary-Copenhaver race isn't the only one heading to a recount either.
Yeah, the state Senate race in District 15 is also headed to a recount. That race pitted incumbent state Senator Liz Brown against challenger Darren Vogt.
And unlike the Deary race, where President Trump was punishing an incumbent who voted against redistricting. Senator Brown was an outspoken supporter of redistricting and has President Trump's endorsement.
But Vote has the backing of Attorney General Todd Rokita, and right now, Vote's only trailing Brown by 15 votes. In a statement announcing his call for a recount, Vote questioned how long the ballot counting process took, the first attempt at voting centers, and the quote, inexplicable closing of blinds at critical times during counting.
Brown is a powerhouse in the Republican caucus. She's the chair of the Judiciary Committee and a member of the Appropriations, Correction, and Criminal Law, Ethics, and Health and Provider Services Committees.
Brown and Rokita have been sparring since last year when Rokita accused Brown of blocking immigration enforcement legislation because she had, quote, an illegal alien in her family. Brown denied the allegation and filed a professional misconduct complaint against Rokita.
Senator Jim Banks has also criticized Brown, and Vote is one of his staffers.
So there are 2 recounts in Indiana state Senate races, but how do they work?
Well, this is a multi-step process, and we shouldn't expect results anytime soon.
No, that's right. No. The first part has already happened. Indiana State Police have taken custody of all the ballots in these races, either by physically taking them or changing the locks on the rooms where they're held.
That's easy in District 15, which is all inside Allen County, but District 23 is a different story. It stretches across several counties, each of them holding some of the ballots in the race.
The next step will be the actual recount itself. The bipartisan State Board of Accounts will recount each of the ballots, and they won't be alone.
A representative from both candidates in each race will be there as each ballot is counted, and they'll have the right to challenge any of the ballots.
Those challenged ballots will then go to the Indiana Recount Commission. The commission will have the final say on whether a ballot should be part of the final vote tally or thrown out.
The commission has 3 members, one from each party, and is headed up by the Secretary of State, Diego Morales. The commission takes a vote on what happens to each challenged ballot, to keep it or discard it.
Democrats have voiced concerns that at least in Deary's race, Morales should step aside. They say he has a relationship with Turning Point, a Turning Point USA group that has backed Copenhagen, the challenger.
But Morales has said no way, saying it is part of his job as Secretary of State and he intends to follow through. We are joined now here in studio by William Groth, an attorney here in Indianapolis with a focus on labor and voting rights. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So I want to start off with, can Copenhagen get those ballots thrown out over this voting? What happened here?
Well, there are no ballots to review because these 14 voters, it's my understanding, weren't challenged and cast their ballots. And those ballots were commingled with other ballots, so it would be impossible now to identify them. And as you've mentioned, the Recount Commission's function is to look at challenge ballots and decide whether or not those should be counted in the final tallies.
So, Attorney Groth, if those ballots were to have been challenged by law, they're supposed to have been challenged right at the polls that day themselves when these folks were voting. Is that correct?
Yes, there's a statutory procedure that covers that. If a poll worker believes that a voter either didn't vote in the primary, the last primary, or doesn't intend to vote in the general election for a majority of the candidates whose party's ballot he is requesting, he can be challenged, and then he is given an opportunity to sign an affidavit.
Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that the Recount Commission agrees with Copenhagen, throws out the ballots. Does Senator Deary or those voters, do they have any recourse when the commission makes a decision like that, or is that it?
Well, there is a right to judicial review.
Okay.
But there aren't any ballots to throw out. Nobody can identify
So
them.
you're saying the ballot for these people, that's been put in with all the others, so there would be no way to pull that particular one out.
That's correct.
How unusual is it for a candidate to not only ask for a recount, but then ask to depose voters?
Never heard of such a thing. I just find it appalling because voters have the right to privacy and anonymity when they cast their ballot. They have the right to associate with whichever political party they choose, and they have the right to change their mind from time to time. And then we also have independent voters who don't really, who switch back and forth regularly, between the Republican Party, some even libertarian.
Attorney Groth, for those who are watching that might not understand all the intricacies of the system, and there's a lot to them, when you register to vote here in Indiana, they don't register you as Republican, Democrat, Independent. There's no record of what party you affiliate with, right?
That's exactly right. It's because we don't have what is called a closed primary. We don't have a totally open primary. We have kind of a hybrid between the two. So when I register to vote, I don't register as a Republican or a Democrat, I just register. And then I have the right, when I vote in a primary election, to request either political party's ballot. I can switch back and forth if I want, and it's my constitutional right to associate with whichever party I want.
But there is a record, though, of which ballot you asked
Yes.
for in the primary, right?
Yes,
Okay.
and if I, for example, voted in the Republican primary last time, and I appear at a primary, and I ask for a Democratic Party ballot, that is when I could be challenged by one of the poll workers and required to sign an affidavit if I wanted to proceed and vote in that party's primary.
Okay.
How does a poll worker know, though? We were talking about lists back in the day, right? Folks were at the polls and they kind of had lists and knew if you came in and asked for a certain primary ballot, well, they knew the last time you had voted in a different primary, correct?
Correct. I mean, it's perfectly possible to look at a voter's voting history to determine which political party he affiliates by virtue of his past primary voting, and then to be prepared to challenge that voter and require that voter to sign an affidavit.
In Indiana, though, they keep track of if you vote in the general election, but they don't track how you voted,
Oh, of
right?
course
That's
not.
Not in the general, right?
correct,
Yeah,
right.
it's a private choice.
So if somebody is asked to sign an affidavit that says, okay, I'd like a Republican primary ballot, and I'm signing this that says I'm going to vote for a majority of Republican candidates in the general, there's really no way to know if they do that, right? I mean, there's not.
That's correct. That's correct.
Unless they would post it on
Social media, right. And then that's how folks know.
Okay.
Okay, so let me ask you this. There's another layer to this. Last legislative session, there was a bill that was proposed that would have required folks to declare a party, Republican or Democrat, about 6 months before a primary if they wanted to vote in it. This bill didn't even make it out of committee. Linda Hansen with the League of Women Voters of Indiana says now with this recount petition from Copenhagen, she expects that we'll see a similar bill in this next legislative session. Would that effectively close Indiana's primaries if something like that passed?
Well, I haven't seen the bill, but it sounds as if there's been an effort to move in that direction. I personally think that would be a bad decision for the legislature to make because it's just it would increase what is already a very polarized electorate. I mean, I think it's a good thing to have, to allow voters to vote depending on their preferences and for one political party, and then the next time a different political party, if that's their wish. I mean, that's the very definition of an independent voter.
All right.
I mean, it's no secret the voter turnout has been difficult in Indiana, low, especially in the primaries. Do you think this Copenhagen petition, this going on, impacts people then wanting to vote in primaries in the future?
Well, I certainly hope not, but that's why I'm very concerned about this notion of subpoenaing voters, putting them on a witness stand under oath, and then asking them effectively how did they vote in the election by secret ballot. I think that sends a wrong message to Hoosier voters, and could be another disincentive for them to vote at all, particularly in the primary elections. I think we want to encourage broader participation rather than, intimidate voters from voting.
All right. Well, it is certainly a case that we and everyone else will be watching to find out what happens in the next steps. William Groth, thank you so much. Really appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Attorney Groth. We appreciate it.
A huge shakeup this week in the race for Indiana Secretary of State.
Top Republicans withdrawing their endorsements and calling on the incumbent to drop out.
He's thinking about it. He's praying about it. That's what he told me as yesterday when we talked, and this morning when we texted.
Next on Crossroads Politics, how the rest of the field is responding as Diego Morales loses top backers.
President Trump is getting some strong pushback from some Republican senators to a new so-called anti-weaponization fund. I'm Alice Barr in Washington, and I'll explain with all the details coming up.
Welcome back. A big shakeup in the biggest statewide race in Indiana this year.
Two of the state's top Republicans are withdrawing their endorsements of incumbent Indiana Secretary of State Diego Morales.
Yeah, the announcement comes with less than a month to go before both Republicans and Democrats hold their state party conventions and pick the Secretary of State nominees for November. And Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita says if they nominate Morales, he doesn't think he can win. Rokita said he asked Morales yesterday to step out of the race.
He's thinking about it. He's praying about it. That's what he told me yesterday when we talked and this morning when we texted.
During his time as Indiana's Secretary of State, Morales has found himself at the center of controversy and the target of criticism for some of his choices while in office. Rokita thanked Morales for his service, but called some of his actions self-inflicted wounds, saying he felt a responsibility to recommend that delegates vote for another candidate at next month's convention.
When you think about some of the controversies that Morales has been embroiled in, a lot of these were self-imposed, and it's made it more challenging for some of his otherwise supporters within the party to really get behind his candidacy.
UIndy political science professor Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson says even with the loss of support from Banks and Rokita, a lot could depend on whether Morales believes he would still have the support of delegates.
Morales, I believe, would need to feel very confident that there was no pathway to victory in order to drop out 1 month before.
One person who knows very well about the power of convention delegates and their votes is Lieutenant Governor Micah Beckwith. Delegates chose Beckwith as the Lieutenant Governor candidate at the last state Republican convention over Governor Mike Braun's preferred candidate. When asked about the pressure on Morales to step aside, Beckwith issued a statement which said in part, quote, "Convention races belong to the delegates, and they have my full faith and support to make their choice of who will become the Republican nominee for the Secretary of State of Indiana." And despite the calls for him to step aside, Morales is defiant. A few hours after Rokita called for him to step down, Morales put out a statement saying in part, quote, "Delegates will decide who will be the Republican nominee for Indiana Secretary of State. The decision belongs in the hands and only the hands of Republican convention delegates, and I'm confident I'll be renominated. I look forward to seeing Republican delegates in Fort Wayne on June 20th. So definitely not stepping out of the race.
And all of this as a fourth Republican enters the race, who is a staffer for Senator Jim Banks, right?
Right. So the new candidate is Max Engling. And as you said, he's a senior advisor to U.S. Senator Jim Banks, who also weighed in hard on this year's state Senate primaries. Engling was also a candidate for Congress in the 2024 Republican primary for Representative Victoria Sparks' seat in District 5. He got about 9% of the vote there.
So tell us about the other Republicans in the race.
Conservative Jamie Reitnauer and Knox County Clerk David Shelton were already running against Morales. Shelton issued a statement saying in part, quote, "This office is too important to be consumed by distractions, instability, and political damage control. Indiana Republicans deserve a nominee who's prepared on day one to restore professionalism, integrity, and confidence to the office."
And of course, that's just the Republican side of things. On the Democratic side, you've got veteran and business owner Blythe Potter running against Bo Bai, the son of former Senator Evan Bai, on the Democratic side. Lori Schilling is running as the Libertarian, and former Indianapolis Mayor Greg Ballard is working to get signatures to be on the Lincoln Party ticket.
Both Democrats and Ballard sent statements to 13 News. We have those right now up on WTHR.com/politics.
What a race.
What a race.
Who knew that the Secretary of State race would be the race to watch?
It is
in
the
Indiana,
race
right?
to watch. Yep, political experts calling it that.
In national news, President Trump's success in Republican primaries here and across the country may not be translating the same way on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, he's facing growing resistance from Republican lawmakers, as Alice Barr reports from Washington.
Fresh off primary victories for Trump-backed candidates, the president is hitting headwinds in Congress, with some Republicans balking at a pair of priorities. First up, a $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund.
This is just stupid on stilts.
The plan to use taxpayer money to pay back people who claim they were unfairly prosecuted under the Biden administration. That could include convicted January 6 rioters the president pardoned.
These people don't deserve restitution. Many of them deserve to be in prison.
The Senate scrapped a Thursday vote on a Republican package to fund ICE and Border Patrol after a closed-door briefing with top Justice Department officials on the anti-weaponization fund left GOP senators with serious questions.
The kind of gut reaction is, that's not right. And if it's not right, we shouldn't be doing it.
Cassidy is one of two sitting Republican senators President Trump opposed in the primaries. Now, with some GOP members of both the Senate and House also objecting to $1 billion in funding for White House ballroom security.
What I do not support is one single dime of taxpayer money going to a ballroom.
NBC News pressed the president on the new fractures.
Are you losing control of the Senate Republican?
I don't know. I really don't know.
The president still has broad GOP support in Congress and has sharply defended his proposals, long railing against Biden-era prosecutions and arguing the White House
Won't be a very secure place.
without the ballroom funding. Police officers who defended the Capitol on January 6 have already sued to block the anti-weaponization fund. The acting attorney general said an applicant's record of violent behavior would be taken into consideration, with 5 commissioners set to be chosen in the coming weeks to decide who gets paid. In Washington, Alice Barr, NBC News.
And still ahead on Crossroads Politics, time is running out for Illinois lawmakers.
They're in a race to keep Indiana from stealing away the Chicago Bears, but the clock's ticking. What's holding up their stadium counteroffer and how little time is left? Next here on Crossroads Politics.
Welcome back. Here are some of the top stories this week here and across the nation.
The clock's running out for Illinois lawmakers hoping to keep the Chicago Bears from moving here to Indiana. The holdup is where in Illinois the Bears would be. Chicago politicians want the Bears to stay in the city proper, but the team already owns property in the Arlington Heights suburb. The Illinois legislative session ends May 31st.
The Department of Veterans Affairs says the Roudebush VA Medical Center will get infrastructure upgrades. Funding will come in the second quarter. It's part of the $4.8 billion being used for VAs across the country. This money will be used for repairing roofs on buildings 7 and 43, plus replacing the parking garage sprinkler system.
U.S. crude oil inventories are draining at the fastest pace ever. Just last week, the stockpiles plunged by 17.8 million barrels. That's the biggest one-week decline in more than 40 years. The prior records were set in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine.
Indiana Senator Todd Young helped pass a change to U.S. Senate rules, banning senators from betting on prediction markets. Those markets let users bet on everything from the weather to election results and even wars. Young called on more legislation and similar rules in the House. And that does it for this week's episode of Crossroads Politics. I'm Emily Longnecker.
I'm Dustin Grove. For all of us here at 13 News, thanks so much for watching. We hope to see you next time.